Hello, this is a demonstration of an example of accounts payable automation using Record Studio with our advanced capture engine and bidirectional integration with an accounting system. This process will start with receiving a vendor invoice, scanning it, and automatically capturing relevant data from the image. The integration will automatically create the invoice in the accounting software. Record Studio will route the invoice to the appropriate user to approve payment. And finally, when the invoice has been approved for payment, we'll pay the bill from the accounting system, and then I'll show you how the integration assists the accounting person by providing access to relevant AP documents that are also stored in Record Studio. We'll begin by capturing an invoice. In this case, since I don't have a scanner connected to my laptop, I'm going to use an image that I have on my hard drive. We could also scan directly from a scanner if we had one connected, or we could load images that had been scanned on pretty much any device, including network copiers, multifunction peripherals, or other devices that can scan and store on a network drive. So I'm going to choose my scan button, and I have an invoice saved on my hard drive prepared for this. So now that the software has loaded the image, we're going to choose Next Task, which is for it to recognize the document. Using what's called fingerprinting technology, the advanced capture engine is comparing this image to its database to identify that this is A, an invoice, and B, it's from the vendor rent-a-crate. Once it's identified the document, it's going to populate the predefined fields with information that it's been trained to extract. Once the capture engine has been taught how to interpret an invoice from a specific vendor, it will remember this in the future. Now we are on the verification screen. This is where the advanced capture engine shows us what it read from the invoice. You may have noticed that a couple of these fields are highlighted in yellow. This is because although optical character recognition, or OCR technology, is very good nowadays, it's not perfect still. The advanced capture engine is smart enough to evaluate its own work and look at the results, and when it doesn't have a high level of confidence in those results, it marks them with yellow highlighting for human eyes to take a look at and verify that the results are correct, or correct them if necessary. In a different example, we might also see a field that was highlighted in red, which would indicate that the results didn't match a rule that we had configured on that field. A good example of that would be if we had read something like Tuesday when the software was expecting a date field. The software would evaluate the results that it extracted, and if it was a valid date, it would be good, and if it was not a valid date, it would flag it in red for us to take a look at and make an evaluation and correction. Back to the example at hand. First, we're going to check the invoice number field because we can see that it's highlighted in yellow. And that looks okay. Now we'll check the contract number field because again it's highlighted in yellow. For the vendor rent-a-crate, this maps to the order number field on the invoice, and again it looks like the engine got a good read. I noticed, however, that the invoice didn't get a good read on invoice amount. This is not a big deal. I'll just click onto the field on the left side of the screen, and then I'm going to click on the invoice amount over on the right, and you can see just that simply we remapped the field. Now that I've shown you how little effort it took to capture the invoice and the data, I'd like to mention that if this had been a brand new vendor, all we would have needed to do was to click into each of the 5 fields and map them just exactly like I did for invoice amount. And then the next time we received an invoice from that new vendor, the fingerprint would be recognized and the engine would remember what we had done and do it for us automatically. At this point, we're ready to finish processing this invoice in the advanced capture engine. If we did have more than one invoice to process in this batch, we would simply click the Next Document button at the bottom of the screen and repeat these steps as needed. Once an operator has used the advanced capture engine a few times, it's not uncommon for them to be able to process several documents per minute. Since we don't have any additional invoices to process in this batch, I'm simply going to click Next Task up at the top of the screen, and the advanced capture engine will export the image and the data about the image to Record Studio automatically. Now I'm going to go into Record Studio. We're logged in as an AP clerk right now, so based on that user's role, the interface is customized to screens that he or she needs to do their job. Later in the demo, we'll see how other users have different components in their interface. So we have a workspace configured for this AP user called Recent Invoices, and the invoice hasn't shown up here yet, and so I'm going to refresh the program. Since I already had the screen loaded, it didn't show up automatically when we scanned it. But you can see right here we have the invoice that we just scanned. One piece of information that the AP clerk might want to know right now is what's the status of this invoice. And we can see right here on the screen that this invoice has a status of pending manager approval. As an AP user, I know that invoices have a workflow associated with them, and if I right-click on this invoice, I can choose to view workflow status. And I can see right now that this invoice was, because it had a total of over $200, required department manager approval. I can drill down and I can see that this invoice required an operations manager to approve it. So next we're going to log into Record Studio as John Doe, who's our operations manager. I'd like to point out that this user has different screens and icons that are relevant to his needs to do his job. So in this case, what I want to do in my role as the operations manager is go into my workflow inbox, which I'll do by clicking workflow activities at the bottom of the screen. And I see that I have an invoice to approve. I'm going to double click on it to open it. And right away, I could approve or reject this invoice, or perhaps I need to look a little deeper to evaluate whether I should approve this for payment. Based on the information that we extracted during the capture process, Record Studio has automatically associated this invoice with other related documents. And I can view these associated documents from this menu. For example, I might need to view the contract with this vendor or the purchase order that's associated with this invoice. As we look at this purchase order, you may notice that it's an Excel spreadsheet. We have a built-in viewer for Excel and other Office documents that allows us, provided we have sufficient rights to do so, to make changes from within Record Studio. Any changes that we made here would be stored as a new version of the spreadsheet with the original version saved but archived. I might also want to mark up the invoice. To do that, I'll click on the Checkout button, and once I have the invoice checked out, I can make annotations, put sticky notes on the document. I can highlight text if I want to. And maybe I want to put a stamp on the document. So I just click the Save button to make sure that my changes are held. That just scratches the surface of options available to us, but one other thing that I might want to do is to attach supporting documentation, such as a packing slip that shows that we received the merchandise that we're being invoiced for. In order to attach that, I need to check the document out, and then I can go into my other options menu and choose supporting attachment. So in order to attach that packing slip, I will click the intuitively labeled button with the paperclip, where I can choose a document type if I decide to, but I can also cancel out of choosing a document type and just go directly to a file that I want to attach as my supporting attachment. And now I can save this to make sure that my attachment is attached and remains in the system. So having done my procedural tasks and made sure that the invoice was good and looked at the contract if I needed to, verified that the invoice falls within the scope of the purchase order, I'm ready to approve this invoice. And so I'm just going to click the Approve button, and Record Studio will prompt me to add a note to my approval. So I'm going to say yes, checked everything, attached, packing slip, okay to pay. Alright, so now we're going to close Record Studio and we're going to log back in as the AP clerk. So now logged into the system as the AP clerk, this time when I open my workflow activities, I can see first that the invoice status is pending check. And now when I double click on this, I can choose to open the workflow, which will open the invoice and will also give me the opportunity to see that the operations manager approved this invoice, when he approved it, who the logged in user was, and it includes, of course, notes that he made as he was approving that. I could add a note here myself. I could view the workflow status where I can see that the invoice is ready for payment. And the last task that I'm going to do on this is I'm going to mark this as processed. However, I do, of course, want to actually pay the bill before I mark it as processed. So now we're going to see the product of the integration with the accounting system. In this case, we're using QuickBooks, and the invoice was automatically sent to it. We could do this with almost any accounting package. So now if I scroll down to my Rent-A-Crate vendor, I can see the invoice that was created. So I'm ready to go pay the bill. So I'll click on the home screen and click Pay Bills, and I'll find my Rent-A-Crate invoice, and I'll choose to pay that bill. And QuickBooks says that it's done paying the bill and a check was cut. So we've paid the bill. As you saw before, we could go into the workflow activity screen to access the invoice that we've been working with, but since it's actually on the screen where I am, I can simply double click that and achieve the same results. So I can now view the check that was cut from QuickBooks, and it's been automatically loaded into Record Studio and associated with our invoice. And again, I could review any of the other related documents. So finally, all I have left to do is to mark this invoice as processed. And in this case, I'm going to choose not to add a note because nobody's going to look at this subsequently. And I'll allow Record Studio to close the invoice for me. So now I want to show you some of the other direction of integration. So I will go back into QuickBooks. So back in our accounting software in the Vendor Center, I can open up this bill, and I'm looking at this bill, and as the accounting user, I'm going, I need to take a look at that invoice. By using a hotkey, I can actually pull up the invoice that's stored in Record Studio directly from the accounting software. This is a very powerful feature. So while I'm in Record Studio and I have this invoice selected, I can click on this vendor info link and load the screen of information about the vendor. But perhaps I might want to do that from the accounting software as well. So back in the Vendor Center, from my vendor information screen in QuickBooks, I can use another combination of hotkeys, and Record Studio will recognize that, and it will load the vendor file for me. And from that screen, I can see any of the documents that are part of that vendor file. Again, this is a very powerful integration that can greatly assist accounting users. They're going to know the information about their vendor, but perhaps they need to view the contract or something like that. And so it's very easy for us to provide that integration so that they can get to those search screens. And speaking of searching, I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about searching within Record Studio. So we can, of course, do an advanced search where we might, specify that we wanted to look at an invoice. We might want to search for an invoice, and we might actually know that the invoice number was MA-95,000. And we could search for that. Using advanced searching will provide us with the smallest number of results and, the most targeted results. Now, that's not always going to be an option. Sometimes we may not necessarily know exactly what we're looking for. We just know that there was something to do with a library card. For that, we'll use the global search tool. And as the screen loads our global search results, we can see that we found several items in Record Studio that contain library cart, and this might contain the words library cart in the text of the document or in the fields that we've defined. We have some Record Studio documents, and if we had configured Record Studio, it could index our Exchange server, and we might find emails that had the words library cart in them. Additionally, Record Studio has been configured to index some network drives, and so we can take a look at this and we can see that there are numerous instances where documents contain the text library cart. It also found a document that we have on our desktop that includes the words library cart to demonstrate this. This concludes the recorded portion of this demonstration.